12 years, 14 specialists. Not one of them ever heard her raise her voice. Vivienne Sorrell ran a $6 billion media empire through a tablet that spoke for her, and the world had grown so used to her silence that no one thought to question it anymore. No one asked why a woman who could still laugh, could still gasp, could still cry out in her sleep, had not spoken a single audible word in over a decade. No one, that is, except the piano tuner. She wasn't a doctor. Not anymore. She was a single mother in a canvas tulle apron, kneeling in front of a Steinway that didn't need her nearly as much as she needed the work. She listened to Vivienne Sorrell for 11 seconds. Then she said 4 words that 14 specialists never had. And from that moment, nothing in that house stayed the same. Keep watching, because what happens next unravels 12 years of a secret someone worked very hard to keep buried. The fog off the reservoir hadn't lifted by 9 that morning, and Nora Kessler had long since stopped expecting Tuesdays to go the way she planned them. She kept a folding cart in the back of her hatchback for jobs like this one. A full estate tuning, 6 pianos on the work order, though she suspected by the state of the smaller ones that only 2 had been touched by human hands in the last several years. The rest were furniture. Beautiful, tragic furniture. She'd taken over her father's piano service route 11 years ago, back when it was still just Kessler and daughter stitched crookedly onto a business card he had printed as a joke that turned out not to be one. She had not planned, at 17, to spend her adult life with her ear pressed to a soundboard listening for the tiny disagreements between strings. She had planned, for a long time, to spend it in a clinic, listening to something else entirely. She pulled into the circular drive of Larkspur House at 8:50, 10 minutes early, the way her father had taught her to always be. The estate sat on 11 private acres at the edge of the reservoir, a compound of glass and reclaimed stone that had been built, according to the tabloids she tried not to read, by Desmond Calloway's design team, rather than any architect Vivienne Sorrell had chosen herself. Nora had been coming to Larkspur House twice a year for 3 years, ever since the previous tuner retired, and in that time she had seen Vivienne Sorrell in person exactly twice, both from a distance, both flanked by an assistant and a wall of quiet, expensive competence. Fiona Reyes met her at the service entrance with a clipboard and the specific, practiced warmth of someone who had spent a decade being the only soft edge in a very hard building. "Music room in the East Parlor today," Fiona said. "The Bosendorfer in the East Wing hasn't been touched since spring. She'll be working through the morning in the private study, so I'll need you to keep the connecting doors closed once you're past the parlor." "Understood," Nora said, because it always was. She'd packed Milo's lunch before dawn, the way she did every day that started before 6, and she'd gotten it wrong again. String cheese instead of the cubed kind he actually liked, a detail that would surface later as a minor betrayal at pickup. She thought about that, and about the voicemail from Dr. Ansel Whitcomb she still hadn't listened to, sitting in her phone for 19 days now like a stone in a shoe, as she wheeled her tool case down the marble corridor toward the music room. The house was cold in the particular way very expensive houses are cold, climate control calibrated to a temperature no human body actually enjoys, as if comfort itself were beneath the architecture. Nora had noticed, over 3 years of servicing this house, that she never once heard music playing in it. A house built around 2 grand pianos and a woman who had once, before Nora's time, sold out arenas on 3 continents, and it was, in 11 years of visits, the quietest building she had ever worked in. She set up in the music room first, the Bosendorfer patient and slightly sulking under a fine layer of dust, and worked through the unisons methodically, the way her father had taught her, not rushing, listening for the beat frequencies the way another kind of clinician might listen for an arrhythmia. It took her 90 minutes. She was folding her tools back into the case when she heard, through the connecting door to the private study, a sound that stopped her hands completely. A cat. She found out later it was an elderly gray tabby named Cassius, who belonged to Fiona and had the run of the ground floor, had knocked a stack of folders off the edge of the desk in the next room. And Vivienne Sorrell, unguarded, alone, startled, had made a sound. Not a gasp of breath. Not the dry, airy exhale Nora had read about in every clinical summary of severe bilateral vocal fold paralysis. The kind of sound a person makes when the folds cannot come together at all, when the only air moving past them leaks out shapeless and silent. This was a short, sharp, fully voiced yelp, pitched, resonant, unmistakably produced by two vocal folds meeting cleanly in the middle for a fraction of a second before they let go. Nora had spent 9 years of her professional life listening to exactly that distinction. She had made her entire early reputation on being able to hear it in a hallway, through a door, before a patient ever sat down in her clinic chair. Her body reacted to the sound before her conscious mind caught up to what it meant, the old reflex sliding back into place like a key, finding a lock it hadn't touched in years. She didn't decide to say anything. The words were simply already out, low, almost to herself, before she'd finished thinking them. That's not paralysis. There was a long silence on the other side of the door. Then it opened. Vivienne Sorrell stood in the doorway of her own study, tablet in one hand, her expression unreadable in the specific way Nora recognized from photographs. A face that had learned, over 12 years without a voice, to communicate everything through the eyes and almost nothing through the mouth, because the mouth had stopped being a reliable messenger a long time ago. She was tall, dressed in the kind of clothes that photographed as effortless and cost more than Nora's car, silver threading through dark hair. She'd stopped dyeing sometime in the last few years. She looked at Nora for a long moment, then typed something into her tablet with quick, economical thumbs, and the flat synthesized voice read it aloud into the room. "What did you say?" It wasn't a question, not in tone. Nora considered, for exactly as long as it took to close her tool case, whether to walk it back, to say something about acoustics or apologize for the interruption. She didn't. "I said that's not paralysis," she said. "Bilateral vocal fold paralysis doesn't produce a yelp like that. If your folds were truly paralyzed in an abducted position, that sound would have come out as air. No pitch, no edge to it. What just happened had both." Vivienne's thumbs moved again. The tablet spoke. "You're the piano tuner." "I'm also the piano tuner," Nora said, which was as much correction as she allowed herself. Something shifted in Vivienne's face, not quite an expression, more the muscular preamble to one. She didn't type anything else. She simply looked at Nora for 11 long seconds. Nora counted them without meaning to, an old habit from clinic rooms where she'd learned to read a patient's silence the way other doctors read vitals. And then she turned and walked back into the study, and the door did not close behind her, which Nora understood, correctly, as an invitation she was not required to accept. She left anyway. She had a route to finish and a son to collect by 4. But she thought about it the entire drive home, and she thought about it while she reheated pasta Milo wouldn't eat because it had the wrong kind of sauce texture, a distinction he explained to her with total seriousness, and she thought about it lying awake at 1 a.m. listening to the furnace cycle on and off, turning over the 11 seconds of silence in that doorway like a stone she couldn't put down. Vivienne did not say anything to anyone about it. Not to Fiona, not to her legal counsel, not to Desmond Calloway when he called that evening to review the Q3 licensing numbers for the label, his voice, as always, warm and certain and slightly too fast, as if he were perpetually one sentence ahead of whatever conversation he was actually having. She simply sat with it. But sitting with it required a kind of attention she hadn't spent on her own body in a very long time, because for 12 years, other people had done the noticing. Specialists noticed. Desmond noticed. Fiona noticed. Vivienne had learned, slowly and without ever deciding to be the subject of all that noticing rather than its source. That night, alone in her bathroom, she looked at her own throat in the mirror for longer than she had in years. She swallowed. She hummed, very quietly, the way she used to when she was young, and it was still an unremarkable thing to do, and felt, for half a second, something that might have been vibration, or might have been imagination dressed up as hope, which was a costume Hope had worn for her more than once before, and she no longer trusted it on sight. She picked up her tablet at 9:40 that night and typed a message to Fiona, the piano tuner from this morning. I need her full name and contact information by tomorrow. Fiona, reading it from her own apartment 2 miles away, was quiet for a moment before she typed back that she'd have it in the morning. Tonight, Vivienne wrote. Please. The file Fiona compiled sat open on Vivienne's screen an hour later. Nora Kessler, 35. Former clinical background, speech-language pathology, voice and upper airway specialization, 8 years at the Ashford Regional Voice Center before resigning her clinical practice 6 years prior. 1 malpractice complaint, settled, non-public terms. Current employment, independent piano tuning and restoration, self-operated, 3 years at this address. Vivienne read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time, the way she'd taken to doing whenever a piece of information didn't fit cleanly into the shape she already understood the world to have. Why is a voice specialist tuning pianos? She thought, and there was no one in the room to ask, which had become, over the years, its own kind of answer. She arranged, through Fiona, a second visit for that Thursday, a fabricated request for an emergency inspection of the Bosendorfer's action, an excuse invented and delivered without either of them commenting on the fact that it was an excuse. Before ending the call, Vivienne added one instruction, typed with the particular flatness her tablet gave to everything regardless of how carefully she meant it. When she arrives, bring her to the study directly. Don't mention it to Desmond first. Nora knew by the time she reached the second floor that it wasn't a real repair call. The house had the same cold, the same marble, but Fiona was waiting at the top of the stairs instead of the service entrance, and her expression had the careful neutrality of a person carrying out an instruction she had privately decided was not hers to question. The study door was open. Vivienne was not at her desk this time. She was seated in a wing-back chair angled toward the door, hands folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone who had rehearsed the posture, tablet resting on the armrest. You used to treat this, she typed, and the synthesized voice read it into the room before Nora had even set down her tool case. Voices. People who couldn't speak. I did, Nora said. I don't anymore. You heard something in me yesterday that 14 specialists in 12 years never mentioned in a single report. A pause while she typed further. I'm not asking you to treat me. I'm asking you what you heard. Nora was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't hesitation so much as the weighing of a debt she wasn't sure she wanted to collect on. She'd spent 6 years building a life specifically insulated from this exact kind of question. Functional voice disorder, she said finally. Also called psychogenic aphonia, though I hate that term. It makes it sound imaginary, and it isn't. Your vocal folds aren't damaged. They're not paralyzed in the structural sense. Nothing severed, nothing atrophied, no fixed joint. What's happening is that your brain has stopped sending them the signal to phonate voluntarily. But the pathway's still there. That's why you can still cough, laugh involuntarily, cry out when you're startled. All of that runs through older, more automatic circuits that don't require conscious permission. Voluntary speech does. And at some point, for some reason, your nervous system decided that voluntary speech was no longer safe to produce, and it shut the door on it completely. Vivienne's hands did not move toward the tablet for a long moment. And what closed the door? She typed at last. It was less a question than a demand for an answer she already suspected. I don't know, Nora said. But I think you do. The silence that followed had a different texture than the one from the day before. This one had an edge to it, the kind Nora recognized from 100 consultation rooms. The specific quiet of a person standing at the very lip of a memory they had spent years walking carefully around. I'd like you to leave, Vivienne typed. Nora nodded, picked up her case, and got as far as the doorway before she stopped, without turning around. "The thing that fixes this doesn't come from me," she said. "It requires you to say something out loud that you have never once let yourself say. I can't do that part for you. I don't think anyone can." Then she left. She did not look back to see what, if anything, had landed. Vivienne did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of a bedroom too large for the amount of her life that actually happened in it, and she let herself go back, for the first time and longer than she could accurately measure, to the last night she had ever used her voice on purpose. She had been 26. The Skyline Farewell Tour, the last of it, the final arena date, the kind of night that gets its own chapter in retrospectives. She and Isla Duran had written every song on that tour together since they were 19 years old, two girls from the same flooded basement apartment building who had built, against every reasonable expectation of the industry, an actual empire out of harmonies neither of them had ever formally trained. For the encore that final night, Vivienne had wanted an entrance nobody would forget, a descent from the rafters on a rigged platform, the two of them together, into the final chorus of the song that had made them both famous. The production team had flagged it as tight on time before the show. Vivienne remembered, with the specific clarity memory reserves for the things it most wants you to forget, waving off the concern. Isla, who always followed wherever Vivienne led because that had simply always been the shape of their friendship, had climbed onto the platform beside her without a second thought. The cable failed 9 feet from the deck. Vivienne had walked away with a fractured wrist and injuries that healed within a season. Isla did not walk away at all. 3 days later, at the private memorial their label had insisted on turning into a public broadcast because the grief, apparently, belonged to the fans too, Vivienne had stood in front of a microphone to sing the song they'd written together, the one everyone in that room was waiting to hear one final time. No sound came out, not a whisper, not a note, just her mouth moving around the shape of the first line while 11,000 people watched in a silence that had never, in 12 years, fully lifted. She had never said Isla's name since. Not once, not in the way that mattered. She had allowed it in press statements written by other people, filtered through legal language and careful publicist phrasing. She had never once let herself say, out loud or even silently in the specific shape of an apology, "I am sorry. I asked you to follow me somewhere I should never have led you." Desmond Calloway had been the production manager on that tour, 29 years old then, sharp and capable, and endlessly reassuring in the exact way a devastated 26-year-old needed someone to be. In the chaos of the following months, as Vivienne's father, the label's founder, grew ill and then passed within the year, Desmond had simply been there, competent and calm, in every room that mattered. He had built the medical advisory arrangement that oversaw her care. He had coordinated every specialist referral for the next 12 years. He had sat, without fail, in every consultation, every disappointing reassessment, every moment a new protocol failed to produce anything. For 12 years, Vivienne had called this loyalty. She had never once, until that week, considered a different word for it. The following evening she asked Fiona, through a message that took her almost 20 minutes to compose and delete and rewrite, to pull her complete medical file, not the summary Desmond's office circulated to the board each year, but the original documentation, every specialist's raw notes, going back to the first appointment after the accident. It arrived in 4 bankers' boxes 2 days later, delivered quietly to a locked drawer in the study rather than the shared archive Desmond's assistant maintained. Vivienne spent an entire night going through them with the same ruthless attention she brought to a licensing contract, and what she found arranged itself, slowly, into a shape she recognized because she had spent 2 decades learning to recognize patterns in numbers, and a pattern in a life was not, it turned out, so very different. 3 separate points across 12 years where a specialist's notes recorded early, tentative improvement. A flicker of voluntary phonation, a recommendation to escalate a specific behavioral therapy, followed within weeks by an unexplained change of physician or a full revision of the treatment protocol. Not dramatic interventions. Small, procedural redirections. One handwritten note in a margin, not in any physician's hand, an assistant's initials beside it. DC requested review prior to continuation. DC, Desmond Calloway. She placed the boxes back in the drawer and locked it, and sat for a long time in the particular kind of stillness that comes after a door opens onto a room you have lived beside your whole life without knowing it was there. The call about Nora came on a Friday. Her contact at the Regional Piano Technicians Guild used the word suspended in the same flat, procedural tone people use when delivering news they know isn't really theirs to feel anything about. A formal complaint had been filed. Unauthorized medical consultation, practicing without a license, exploitation of a vulnerable client, attached to an anonymous account with just enough specificity to sound credible and just enough vagueness to be nearly impossible to trace. Nora listened to the voicemail standing at her kitchen counter while Milo ate cereal at the table behind her, recounting, in exhaustive detail, a disagreement he'd had with a classmate about whether a stegosaurus could theoretically defeat a triceratops in unspecified circumstances. She set the phone down. She stood there for a moment. Then she turned around, sat across from her son, and asked whether he'd remembered to pack his library book. He had not remembered his library book. It was, gratefully, a solvable problem. Fiona told Vivienne about the complaint on a Monday morning, folded into the same briefing as the quarterly board calendar and an overnight update on a distribution contract. Vivienne stopped her at the item and asked her to repeat it. Fiona did. Vivienne asked who had filed it. The name on the form doesn't check out, Fiona said carefully. It traces to a shell account associated with a legal consulting firm. Desmond's office retained them 3 years ago for reputation matters. Vivienne said nothing for a long moment. Then she typed, "Get me Nora Kessler's complete guild file. And clear my 11 o'clock." Desmond arrived at 11:05, unannounced, which was itself unusual for a man who scheduled his own breathing. He sat across from her with the specific warmth he wore the way other men wore cufflinks, visible, deliberate, meant to be noticed and appreciated. He spoke, at some length, about professional boundaries, about the legal exposure of allowing an unlicensed outsider to engage in what could be construed as medical consultation, about how much he only ever wanted to protect her. He used the word protect 4 times. He used her name 5. He did not once ask how she was feeling, and Vivienne, who had spent 12 years failing to notice that particular omission, noticed it now with the sudden, total clarity of someone who has just reread the same document twice and understood it differently both times. "Thank you, Desmond," she typed. "I'll take it under advisement." He left, satisfied. He should not have been. It was a Wednesday when Milo ended up in the East Wing entirely by accident, which is to say the accident was entirely predictable to anyone who had ever spent more than 10 minutes in his company. Nora had brought him along after an early dismissal at school, planning to have him wait in the service hallway while she finished paperwork for the guild complaint, and he had lasted approximately 3 minutes before deciding that waiting was not an activity he currently had any interest in. He found the music room. He found the Bosendorfer, silent and enormous. And he found, in the doorway beyond it, a woman he did not recognize sitting very still in a chair, a tablet resting in her lap. He did not do the thing most adults did, which was arrange his face into careful, apologetic neutrality. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, with total, unguarded interest. "Why don't you just yell?" he asked. "If you're mad. My mom says you're allowed to yell sometimes if something's really wrong. You just have to say sorry after." Vivienne's hands hovered over the tablet. She typed slowly. "I can't." "But you laughed yesterday," Milo said, with the confident authority of an 8-year-old correcting an adult's math. "I heard it from the hallway. It sounded normal." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time and longer than she could remember, she smiled in a way that reached all the way up into her eyes before she'd consciously decided to let it. Nora found her son 40 seconds later, breathless, apologizing before she'd even finished crossing the threshold. She stopped when she saw Vivienne's face. He said something. Vivienne typed, holding the tablet out so Nora could read it before the voice even finished the sentence. About yelling. About being allowed to. He gets that from me, Nora said, though he explains it more confidently than I do. Vivienne looked at both of them for a moment, then typed a longer message. I'm not ready to let this go. Whatever this is. I know what Desmond's people did to your license. I'd like you to come back anyway. Not here. Somewhere off the property. Bring nothing. Just come. Milo, unbothered by the gravity of the moment, looked up from a scuff mark on the floor he'd become interested in. Can I come too? The address Fiona provided was a small guest house 2 properties down the Reservoir Road, technically owned by a corporate holding entity that traced back, eventually, and with some effort, to Vivienne's mother's estate rather than anything Desmond's office managed. It had a wall of west-facing windows and enough bare floor between the sofa and the wall for exactly the kind of work Nora used to do in a clinic room, back when clinic rooms were still part of her life. The first Wednesday, Nora didn't mention voices at all. She asked about Isla. Vivienne answered in single fragments at first, the clipped shorthand of grief that gets compressed, over 12 years, into something small enough to carry without anyone noticing the weight of it. Nora listened the way she used to listen to patients before she stopped, without the forward lean of someone waiting for their turn to speak, simply receiving what was offered and letting the next sentence arrive in its own time. By the end of the hour, Vivienne had typed Isla's name 6 times. The last time, she typed it without any sentence around it at all, just the name, standing on its own, the way a name sounds when a person finally stops apologizing for needing to say it. Was that the first time? Nora asked. In the way that actually counts? Vivienne was quiet for a long moment before she typed, yes. The second Wednesday, Nora introduced a technique from her old clinical training, a laryngeal reset exercise built around gentle, voiced humming paired with a specific breath pattern for counts in, a brief hold, 6 counts out, with a small, voluntary hum invited at the tail end of each exhale. Not commanded, invited. The theory, which Nora explained plainly, was that the neural pathway for voluntary phonation hadn't been destroyed, only walled off, and that certain rhythms of breath and sound could open a narrow, temporary window in that wall. 14 minutes into the exercise, on the exhale, a sound came out of Vivienne that was not speech and was not quite music either. A single, thin, wavering note, barely audible, gone almost as soon as it arrived. But it had pitch. It had voice behind it, deliberately produced, under her own direction, for the first time in 12 years. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Nora kept her eyes on her own folded hands. Vivienne kept hers on the window. The room held very still around the two of them. That was you, Nora finally said quietly. Not an accident. You did that. Vivienne did not type a response. She didn't need to. Desmond Calloway arrived at Larkspur House at 6:50 the following Thursday morning, 40 minutes ahead of his usual schedule, and found the west lot emptier than it should have been. He sat in his car reviewing a report his internal security contractor had sent overnight. It confirmed what he'd already begun to suspect. Nora Kessler and Vivienne Sorrell had been meeting off property, at an address that traced, with some digging, back to the old Durand family trust rather than anything the company's medical office had ever authorized. None of it appeared on the official care calendar. None of it had been routed through the oversight channel Desmond had spent 12 careful years constructing. He understood, slowly and with a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air, exactly what this meant. Not out of malice. In the beginning, that was the version of himself he still returned to, in the moments he needed one. He had built his position, in the early years, out of the ordinary human need to be indispensable, and he had discovered, over time, that the most reliable way to remain indispensable was to ensure that nothing ever fully resolved. A referral quietly redirected. A promising protocol shelved for one that produced gentler, slower, more manageable results. It had been small things for a long time. The money had arrived later, first as a byproduct, and then, gradually, as the actual point. The way those two things tend to blur together once a person stops examining his own reasons closely enough to keep them separate. He called his outside counsel that morning and used the phrase fiduciary incapacity. He used the phrase undue influence. He scheduled an emergency session of the Larkspur House Board for the following Thursday, citing what his memo called a credible risk to the chair's continued sound judgment. Fiona saw the calendar notification at 10:40 that night and forwarded a screenshot to Vivienne within the minute. The third Wednesday session ran from 6 in the morning until past noon. By the end of it, on a single sustained breath, Vivienne produced 4 syllables in a row. Not words yet, not quite, but a clean, connected string of voiced sound, unmistakably under her own control. She did not celebrate. She sat back, closed her eyes, and stayed silent for a long time in a way that had nothing to do with her disorder and everything to do with the size of what had just happened. Nora gave the silence room. She'd learned, a long time ago, that some quiet needs nothing but space to finish doing its work. "Tell me about your husband," Vivienne typed eventually, and Nora, surprised, realized she probably shouldn't have been. She told her the parts that fit into a few sentences. Thomas, 3 years gone, an accident on a wet highway that had nothing to do with anything either of them had done, the kind of loss that doesn't come with a lesson attached, just a hole. She told her, too, about Celeste, the patient whose case had ended her clinical career, a young singer whose voice loss Nora had correctly diagnosed as functional, only to have a senior colleague publicly dismiss the diagnosis as unserious in front of the patient herself, the humiliation of that dismissal landing so hard that Celeste disappeared from treatment entirely, and from public life not long after. And Nora had spent 6 years unable to separate her own correct diagnosis from the damage that followed it. "You treated me," Vivienne typed slowly. "But you haven't treated yourself." Nora looked at the window. "No," she admitted. "I haven't." "The voicemail," Vivienne wrote. "The one you mentioned Milo mentioning." 19 days, he said. Nora hadn't realized her son had said anything about it at all. "It's an offer to come back. Reinstate my clinical license. Take a supervisory position at the training clinic. I haven't decided if I'm allowed to say yes." "Allowed," Vivienne repeated, typing it back exactly. And something in the flat, synthesized delivery of her own word landed harder than if she'd said it herself. The emergency board session convened at 9 on Thursday morning in the glass conference room on Larkspur House's top floor. 11 members around a long, pale table built, Nora had once observed to no one in particular, to project neutrality while enabling exactly the opposite. Desmond sat at the head with the settled confidence of a man who had arranged a room before he ever walked into it. In front of him sat a 7-page proposal, formally bound, requesting an independent capacity assessment of the chair, citing, in careful legal language, undocumented and unsupervised engagement with an unlicensed individual presenting undue influence concerns. He was midway through his opening remarks when the door opened. It wasn't the entrance itself that silenced the room. It was the tablet in Vivienne's hand, held loosely at her side rather than clutched the way it had been for 12 years, and the particular stillness in her face. Not the armor she'd worn into every room for over a decade, but something underneath it that looked, for the first time in a very long while, like solid ground. She crossed to the head of the table and sat, opening a leather folder she'd placed there 40 minutes before anyone else arrived. She lifted the tablet, and the synthesized voice read her opening line into the room. I've been looking forward to this meeting. It's the last one Desmond will attend in this building. His composure held, though something shifted along his jaw. Vivienne, I understand this isn't emotional. She slid a stack of documents to the center of the table before he finished. The original clinical records, her tablet read, retrieved directly from archive, without routing through Desmond's medical office. A second stack followed. The summaries submitted to this board's Health Oversight Committee over 12 years. There are 3 material discrepancies between them. I've marked each one. She placed a third item on the table, a bound research paper. A peer-reviewed study on functional voice disorder recovery rates, submitted for publication 9 years ago. Desmond's office coordinated a formal contest of its review that delayed publication in 2 journals by 14 months. During that delay, not one specialist in my care was shown its findings. Desmond stood. This is not a conversation you're in any state to. Fiona, standing near the door, tapped a key on her laptop. The wall screen behind Vivienne lit with a chain of internal financial transfers, time-stamped and formatted with the flat, damning clarity of an audit. 12 years of consulting payments to Holbrook Wellness Group, the tablet read on. A private vocal rehabilitation entity whose entire client roster consists of 1 patient. $2.1 million, authorized under Desmond Calloway's signature on every transfer. The room had gone very quiet. This is a fabrication, Desmond said, his voice low now. Careful, constructed by someone whose judgment has clearly been compromised by. I just spoke a full sentence to this board. Desmond, Vivienne's tablet delivered, flat and final. For the first time in 12 years. Would you like to explain to this room how that represents compromised judgment? He didn't sit back down. He also didn't speak again. The board chair, a measured, long-serving man named Templeton who had held his position for years by consistently being the last person in any room to raise his voice, cleared his throat and asked Desmond to excuse himself from the remainder of the session pending an independent review. He used the word pending the exact way people use it when they mean something closer to permanent. Desmond left the room. He left the building within the hour, and the review that followed did not end the way his memo had assumed it would. There was one more document Vivienne had not shown the board that morning, because it wasn't the board's to hear first. She'd found it in the same locked archive, buried in a folder of production incident reports no one had opened in 12 years. The original rigging inspection report from the night of the accident, filed and quietly shelved by the production office Desmond had run at the time. It documented a known load-bearing defect in the platform cable, flagged 11 days before the final show, and a signed decision, initial DC, to defer replacement until after the tour concluded in order to protect that quarter's production budget. Vivienne read it seated on the floor of the study at 2 in the morning, the way she had once, 12 years earlier, sat on the floor of a hospital corridor unable to make a single sound. It had never been her recklessness that killed Isla. It had been a decision made in a budget meeting by a man who had spent the next 12 years letting her carry a guilt that was never fully hers to carry, because her guilt kept her quiet, and her silence kept him necessary. She did not confront him with it in the boardroom. She gave it, instead, to the independent investigators the board appointed the following week, and let the truth move at its own pace, the way Nora had once told her it eventually would. Nora was in the hallway outside the conference room when the session ended. She hadn't been invited. She hadn't asked to be. She dropped Milo at school at 7:45, watched him disappear through the gate with his backpack half unzipped the way it always was, and driven across town, and sat down on a bench in the marble corridor because it was the only thing available to her, and it had been enough. Vivienne crossed the hallway toward her without the tablet raised, her pace unhurried, each step landing with a kind of ordinary certainty that hadn't been there 3 weeks earlier. She stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them did anything at all. Then Vivienne typed, quickly, and held it out. "I'm sorry about your license complaint. I know it's connected to Desmond. It's already being withdrawn, Nora said. Fiona called this morning. I know. I asked her to. Vivienne paused, then typed something longer. Why did you stop practicing? The real reason, not the file version. Nora looked at the floor, then back up. Because I was right about Celeste, and being right didn't save her. And after that I wasn't sure I had any business telling anyone else what was happening inside their own throat, if being correct wasn't enough to actually help. Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. Then, you heard something in me from behind a door in 11 seconds that no one else heard in 12 years. That's not someone who forgot how to listen. That's someone who stopped believing she was allowed to say what she heard. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. It was, in its way, the most honest conversation either of them had had with anyone in a very long time. 3 months later, on an ordinary morning with the reservoir fog burned off early for once, Nora sat at her kitchen table with a folder in front of her. Inside it was a completed reinstatement application, signed, dated, an intent line filled in with more certainty than she'd expected to feel when she finally sat down to write it. Returning to clinical practice, voice and functional disorder specialization, supervisory role, Ashford Regional Training Clinic. Her phone buzzed while she was looking at it. Vivienne's name on the screen, 3 short sentences typed out in full, no tablet voice behind them this time, because there didn't need to be. I sang 4 bars at rehearsal this morning. First time in 12 years. Thank you. Nora read it twice. Then she picked up a pen, signed the final line of the application, and sealed the envelope. Milo wandered into the kitchen in his pajamas, dragging the corner of his blanket, and eyed the envelope with the particular gravity he reserved for determining whether something mattered. Is that a good thing, Mom? Yeah, she said. A good thing. He climbed into the chair across from her and accepted the juice she slid toward him, then looked at her with the same unguarded directness that had, 3 weeks ago, cracked open a room he had no idea he was standing in. Is Miss Vivienne coming for dinner again? Nora looked at the envelope, then at her son, then at the window over the sink where the morning was arriving the way mornings do when nothing dramatic is required of them anymore. Ordinary, sufficient, entirely enough. I'll ask her, she said. Milo nodded, satisfied, and drank his juice. 12 years hadn't been a mystery. It had been a story that needed the right person to stay in the room long enough to actually hear it. Nora Kessler had listened, not because she still had the credentials to, but because she had never actually lost the only real instrument the work had ever required. The willingness to sit inside someone else's silence without flinching, and to say, plainly, what she heard there. She had walked into that house with a tool case and 11 seconds of attention. Vivienne Sorrell had walked out of a boardroom, and out of 12 years of a silence someone else had profited from keeping in place. Neither of them had done it alone. That part mattered more than any of the rest, and it would still be true tomorrow.